Welcome. If you are looking for a course to get certified from zero, this is your course. If you are an auditor looking for improvement in your skills for auditing, this is your course. If you are an organization looking for all the documentations you need to excel, this is also your course. In part 1, we covered quality management system, ISO 9001. In part 2, we are going to cover ISO 45001 and ISO 14001, HSE. And in part 3, we will cover food safety management system with ISO 22000. And in part 4, we will cover FSSC 22000. And this presentation, or this course, explores how cold chain organizations globally pass stage 1 and stage 2 and sustain zero findings across all their standards. So we will give you everything you need to have zero findings during the audit, stage 1 and stage 2, and be certified. All right, and we are giving you examples drawn from a successful example from New Zealand. We are using New Zealand as a benchmark because it's known for excellence in operations across all the mentioned standards. But you can tailor it to your own organization and jurisdiction wherever you are around the world, because these practices are applicable universally. All right, so now let's take a look at HSE compliance in global supply chain operations, or cold chain operations, sorry. Cold chain facilities operates in uniquely challenging conditions, requiring robust health and safety and environmental management and controls. This system must function reliably in cold and also in hot and in wet and in noisy environments with high traffic and constant mechanized activities, ensuring adherence to local and international regulations. So we need to function and adhere also to our local and international regulations. Since we are giving examples from New Zealand, for instance, in New Zealand, this includes compliance with Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015 and the Resources Management Act of 1991. Let's look at the operational characteristics in cold storage environments. Firstly, we have high traffic. In high traffic zones with forklifts and material handling equipment, that's a characteristic in cold chain operations, which requires a strict adherence to guidelines for vehicles and pedestrians operations. All right. And for example, in New Zealand, we need to adhere to the guidelines of WorkSafe New Zealand. And similarly, you can do the same in your own regulatory requirements. The second characteristics of cold chain operations is heavy mechanization and automation, including energy-sensitive refrigeration systems that must comply with regulations for emissions and hazardous substances in your own jurisdictions. In New Zealand context, for example, this includes regulations, EPA, and the HSNO Act of 1996. Third characteristic of cold chain operations is physically demanding work in extreme cold environment and extreme hot environment, necessitating a specific personal protective equipment, PPE, and fatigue management plan. All right. In New Zealand context, we must align with WorkSafe approved code of practice. The fourth characteristics of cold chain operations is shift work carries elevated fatigue risk, which must be managed in accordance with relevant health and safety standards. For example, in New Zealand, it mandates a specific health and safety standards for fatigue management. The fifth characteristic of cold chain operations, contractor and visitors interfaces necessitate clear indications or inductions, clear inductions, and safety protocols compliant with local legislation. All the contractors, as you know, must be given induction and training and be aware. As we all know, most of the major incidences are related to contractors. Not because contractors are not aware of safety requirements or environmental requirements, but because they are not familiar with our own risk in our own facilities, in our own operations. They are not familiar with our hazards. So we need to give them proper inductions, and proper awareness and training and monitoring and management in accordance with local legislations. In New Zealand context, these protocols must adhere to national health and safety legislations of New Zealand. The 6 characteristics for cold chain operations is compliance with relevant National Food Act and safety program. This compliance is essential for food storage and handling everywhere, so you must comply with local regulations. An example in New Zealand's MPI Food Act of 2014 and associated food safety programs. 7th characteristics of cold chain operations is that temperature range and units must align with international and national standards for food safety and quality management to ensure product integrity. And this is crucial for meeting the stringent demands of major retail chains globally. In our context in New Zealand, such as Foodstuff and Woolworths New Zealand. Those are the characteristics of HSE compliance in global cold chain operations. Now let's take a checklist at all the requirements for you to pass your audit without any non-conformance. You need to meet all the checklist. In addition, you need to check out the introductions in part 1 of this course, which is for quality management system, because there we have developed documents that will guide you to meet the requirement. For example, the scope statement, we have given you an example there that you can replicate, and also for other clauses, we have explained each clause and their requirements there, so you need to check it out. Now, to proceed with the checklist, we'll start with clause 4, and in clause 4.1, it requires occupational health and safety context analysis, and the documents required, we need records of our context analysis to be maintained for 3 years, to be retained for 3 years, and also annual review records of our context analysis. The auditor will need evidence to know that the issues are identified and relevant to cold chain operations, including cold environment hazards, forklift operations, manual handling in freezers, shift work fatigue, seasonal peak demands, for example, pre-holiday periods and seasonal produce campaigns. So all this must go into our context analysis. The reviews, input and output also records need to be kept as evidence along with the context of analysis document for the auditors to cover clause 4.1 requirements. And for instance, in New Zealand, these include campaigns for retailers like Foodstuffs or Woolworths New Zealand. Then in clause 4.2, it requires you to create a register for interested parties covering occupational health and safety. And you need to have review records, which you should review annually. Your risk register should be reviewed annually for any updates, at least annually, and retain it for 3 years. And then you submit it to the auditor as an evidence. But the evidence must confirm that, in a written, that workers, unions, regulatory bodies, and insurance providers and contractors and customers are all identified with occupational health and safety expectations. Each must be identified and their requirements and their expectations. For example, in New Zealand, these include WorkSafe New Zealand and ACC, or Accident Compensation Corporation. So when you identify the interested parties, their expectations must be met, must be identified and must be met. And in class 4.3, it's a mandatory requirement here to have a scope statement of occupational health and safety. And along with it, you need to retain the scope review documents, and the retention is for the life of the certification. That's the retention period. The auditor will review your statements for evidence to confirm that all operation sites, including main depots, distribution centers, and activities and shifts and workers, such as permanent workers or temporary workers or contractor workers, all are covered in your statement. So they will review your statement to confirm that. And for example, in New Zealand, this applies to all New Zealand sites, Auckland, Christchurch, Depot, etc. So you must include all the sites. All right, all the sites and all the workers and shifts and activities. Then in class 4.4, it requires you to have a process map. That means we need to create a document for process map for occupational health and safety. Along with it, we need to keep process records and retain them for 3 years. The auditor will look for evidence of occupational health and safety processes being identified, including hazards identification, risk assessment, incident investigation, and emergency responses such as ammonia leak, protocol specific to coal storage. Those are the requirements of class 4. Now moving to class 5. Class 5.1, it requires leadership and workers' participation. And this must be demonstrated through the actions. And we must show evidence and retain evidence of leadership participation and workers' participation as well. The auditor will look for the proof that management is visible on the floor. So are the management visible there during the toolbox talk, during the walk at least once a week or once a month? Are the communication being delivered there? Are there interactions? So we must give those evidence either through a checklist or through photos or through documents. We must prove that the management are visible there. And when the workers also are interviewed or in any shape or form, it must indicate that the management were there. So for example, if we have HSE work weekly once, and we include not all the management, but management representatives to walk the floor, observe the work, contribute, ask questions, interact with workers, get some feedback, and then implement some actions. And if all these are captured, those are also going to be evidence for management visibility. All right, so the auditor will look for management to be visible on the floor and participates in safety meetings and provide resources and hold managers accountable for safety and fostering a strong safety culture across the organization. And this is what I just elaborated. And then in class 5.2, it mandates us to have a policy for occupational health and safety. So this is a mandatory requirement. And as I said earlier, we have developed a policy in part 1 of this course, so you can check it out. So along with this policy, we need policy review records and retain the policy and the review records for the life of the certifications. The auditor will look for evidence that commitment to eliminate hazards exists, to reduce risk, and comply with relevant health and safety legislations. So you must comply with health and safety legislations in your own country. In New Zealand, for example, in New Zealand context, this includes compliant with the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015, HSWA, and local workers' consultation procedures. And then in clause 5.3, it requires us to have responsibility metrics specific for occupational health and safety. So we must have this as a documented information. And assignment records of the responsibilities, the records of assignment also must be maintained. For the duration, along with the metrics, for the duration of the employment of anybody who has been assigned, plus 3 years after their employment, we must maintain the records. Auditors will come to look for evidence that occupational health and safety responsibilities have been assigned, such as HSE manager, health and safety representatives, shift supervisors, and all workers. For example, in New Zealand, these reflect HSWA duties. Class 5.4 requires a consultation procedure. So we must have a procedure for consultation, and also we must have a charter for HSE HNS committee. All right, so those are required documented information, consultation procedure, and charter for committee. And also along with it, we need consultation records, and those records are mandatory to be retained for at least 3 years. All right. Now, the auditors will come to look for evidence through interactions, through records, through actions, through observations, to look for evidence that regular HNS meetings have been taking place and workers' representatives were elected and workers are consulted on hazards, are consulted on change, and are consulted on investigations, whilst ensuring cultural representatives. Responsiveness, all right? Now, in New Zealand context, this is done as per HSWA, or Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015. So you must see your local regulations and comply to conduct consultation procedures and committee charters accordingly with the local regulations. That's class 5. Now let's look to class 6. In class 6.1.1, it requires us to have a documented risk register for occupational health and safety. So we must create a register for occupational health and safety, review it annually, and retain the documents for 3 years. Auditors will come to look for evidence that occupational health and safety risks are identified and opportunities for improvements are determined, tailored to cold storage and logistics operations. So not generic identifications, but specific identifications of risks and also opportunities for improvement. For instance, in New Zealand, this applies to the New Zealand cold storage and logistics context. And then in class 6.1.2, It's a mandatory requirement to have a procedure for hazard identification here, and also to have hazard register as a documented information. So along with this, we have mandatory also to have hazard assessment document. The auditor will come look for proof to confirm that all activities are assessed, such as forklift operations, coal exposure, and hot exposure. I keep mentioning hot exposure because in the Middle East, there is a heat season where, for example, in UAE, where workers, during the hot season, workers is mandatory to give workers break to not work under the direct sun. All right, so if that's applicable to you, you must also adhere to that. Now, auditors will look for evidence that all activities are assessed, such as forklift operation, coal exposure, heat exposure or coal exposure down to minus 25 degrees Celsius typically, and manual handling, slips, trips in wet or icy surfaces, and ammonia exposure from refrigeration systems, and working at height at racking systems. All these must include in your risk assessment. And you must provide it as proof for evidence. Not only identifications, you should have there the controls, measures, the corrective actions, the risk. After assessment, you need to put the controls in place. In class 6.1.3 is a mandatory requirement again to have legal register for occupational health and safety. And along with it, it's mandatory also to have compliance being reviewed every year or every time when the change happen, and retain it for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence that all applicable local laws are identified. For example, in New Zealand, this includes the law that must be identified includes the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015, Health and Safety at Work Act regulations like general risk and workplace management and major hazard facilities, etc. And also WorkSafe New Zealand codes of practice, for example, approved code of practice for handling refrigerant gases. So you need to be specific also with your legal register and compliance reviews. Then in class 6.1.4, it requires occupational health and safety action plan. With action plan, you need to have action records. And the auditor will look for evidence that actions are planned to eliminate or reduce hazards. And your actions are integrated into operations, and responsibility are assigned, and effectiveness is monitored in the relevant operational context. All right. In class 6.2 is mandatory requirement to have occupational health and safety objectives. With these objectives, it's also mandatory to have objective monitoring documents. So you need both documented informations to retain them for 3 years. The auditor will look for evidence when you present your documents. They must confirm that objectives are SMART. For example, 0 lost time injury, LTIs, or reduce near miss by 20%, or 100% forklift pre-start checks, or coal exposure limits or heat exposure limits. All your objectives must be SMART. In New Zealand coal storage facilities, for instance, coal exposure limit is less than 2 hours continuous. So that must be mentioned also in the objectives. That's clause 6. Now let's go to clause 7. Clause 7.1 requires resources planning to be documented information, and you need also resources records to be documented and retained for 3 years. Auditor will look for confirmation of documents that adequate resources have been provided, including personal protective equipment, PPE, in cold weather gear, or high vests or safety boots, and also first aid facilities have been provided and that emergency equipment are provided, and trained first aiders also are provided. So all these must be included. The records must be included at the resources record and retained for 3 years. In New Zealand context, this includes New Zealand trained first aiders and PPE meeting NZS standards or New Zealand standards, New Zealand safety standards. In class 7.2, it requires you to have documented information or to create a document for competence metrics specific to occupational health and safety. Along with it, you need to keep training records with the competence metrics. You need to keep training records and retain them for the duration of employment, plus 7 years after the employment. Auditors will come to confirm that competence requirements are met, such as forklift licenses with national approved operator certifications, for example, and coal environment training, and manual handling, and emergency response, for example, ammonia emergency training. And in New Zealand, this refers to WorkSafe New Zealand approved operator certification. In class 7.3, it requires you to have documented information regarding awareness materials for occupational health and safety. Along with it, you need to keep awareness records and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will look for proof that workers are aware of hazards, their rights also, they are aware of their rights, for example, rights to cease unsafe work, and also they are aware of how to report hazards, and they are aware of emergency procedures specific to operations. So all this awareness training must be provided and also keep the records. And in New Zealand, this includes rights under HSWA and procedures specific to New Zealand operations. We have now in class 7.4, it requires you to document the communication plan for occupational health and safety and have communication records as well, documents, and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence for toolbox talks, safety alerts, incident notifications, and notifications to relevant authorities when required. For instance, in New Zealand, this includes WorkSafe New Zealand notifications for notifiable events as per the HSWA. And in your country, definitely, there are instances for the safety in case of major incident or lost time injury or emergency that you must call authorities. So there must be an evidence for all that, for communication planning. In case of this happen, what should we do? How should we notify the authority? Who should contact them? How and all that. And then in class 7.5, it requires you to have control of the of documents or of records. And here, those records that are under your control, you should retain them for at least 3 years. Now, Auditors will look for evidence that occupational health and safety documents are controlled, records are retained per local legal requirements. All right, in New Zealand, this follows New Zealand legal requirements like WorkSafe New Zealand guidelines. And then if we move to class 8.1, no, that was class 8.1 we covered. No, that's class 7. Now we need to cover class 8. In class 8.1, it requires occupational health and safety operational controls, and we need also to keep control records for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence that controls are implemented, the forklift, for example, forklift segregation to prevent collusion, coal exposure limits, manual handling aid, lockout, tagout procedures, and confined space entry protocols, whilst considering local food safety requirements. So for instance, in New Zealand, these include Food Act of 2014 requirements. Then you have in class 8.1.2, it requires you to have hierarchy of controls documented. Along with it, we need to keep control effectiveness reviews and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence that elimination are prioritized. You know hierarchy of control, right? You start with eliminations, then you do reductions, then engineering, so on until PPE. So you start from the most important. Auditors will come and look most important of control. Auditors will come and look for that elimination, which is the most important elements of control, is prioritized. For example, automated storage and retrieval system. And look, when you prioritize, in case of hierarchy of control, you prioritize, and if you are not able to do that, then you move to the next one. It doesn't mandate you to do the priority. It mandates you to consider it and consider the feasibility. If feasible, you do it. If not feasible, you move to the next kind of control. Elimination is prioritized like automated storage and retrieval systems or engineering controls like barriers and effectiveness and ventilations in chillers and PPE as last resort. This is consistent with relevant guidelines, and in New Zealand, this is consistent with WorkSafe New Zealand guidelines or guidance. And then in class 8.1.3, it requires the management of change procedure. So you need to have procedure for the management of change, MOC. All right? Now, you need also to retain the change records for 3 years because the auditors will come looking for evidence that occupational health and safety impacts are assessed before new equipment, before processes change, before new products, before organizational change. For example, new client requirements. All right? So everything must be assessed and go through the management of change, and you should keep the records as evidence for the auditor. And then in class 8.1.4, it requires you to have procedures for procurement, particularly for OH&S considerations, and you need to keep procurement records. Auditor will look for occupational health and safety requirements with specifications. Suppliers provide safety data. Equipment meets relevant standards. All right. For example, in New Zealand, equipment meets New Zealand standards. For example, an MPI requirements for food contact materials are considered. Then in class 8.2, these are mandatory requirements. You must have documents for emergency response plan, mandatory. And also emergency drill records, also mandatory, and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will come to look for to confirm the evidence that emergencies are identified, for example, ammonia leak, fire, natural disasters, and serious injuries. And procedures also are documented and drills are conducted at least 6 months, like every 6 months. And also, they will look for evidence that plans are reviewed and aligned with local civil defense communications or recommendations. For instance, in New Zealand, all these must be identified and plans in alignment with earthquakes and alignment with New Zealand civil defense recommendations in case of New Zealand. Example. That's class 8. Now, if you look at class 9, it requires you to have documents for monitoring plan of occupational health and safety and keep also monetary records. And auditors will look for evidence to confirm that performance are monitored, including LTI frequency rate, near miss reports, hazards reports, training completion, inspection completion, and reflecting relevant health and safety metrics. For example, in New Zealand, this reflects New Zealand health and safety metrics. In class 9.2, mandatory requirements is to have document for compliance evaluation procedures. So you should have procedure for compliance evaluation and also have compliance evaluation records being kept for 3 years mandatory. Auditors here, auditors will look for compliance being evaluated systematically with all applicable local regulations and requirements, and non-compliance must be identified also and addressed. And for example, in New Zealand, these include HSWA 2015 and WorkSafe New Zealand requirements and EPA Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act of 1996, HSNO. And then in class 9.2, it requires you to have internal audit procedure for occupational health and safety, and the audit records are mandatory. Internal audit records are mandatory here. And the auditor will look for evidence that occupational health and safety audits cover all requirements annually, and auditors are competent in occupational health and safety and the local regulatory frameworks, and non-conformances are corrected in New Zealand, and auditors are competent in New Zealand regulatory frameworks. Clause 9.3, it requires procedures for management review, and the mandatory also for management review records are mandatory requirements here. Auditors will look for evidence that reviews are conducted minimum annually, and all requirements inputs, including incidents, audits, compliance, and objectives, and decisions are documented for continuous improvements in operations. For example, in New Zealand, this supports continuous improvements in New Zealand's operations. Clause 10.2 require incident investigation procedures and corrective action procedures. And along with it, the mandatory requirements, you need incident and corrective actions records and to retain them for 7 years, which is a mandatory requirement globally, and also in New Zealand, this is a mandatory requirement by WorkSafe New Zealand. Auditors will look for evidence that all incidents are investigated, including injury, near misses, dangerous occurrences, and root causes are identified, and corrective actions are effective and relevant. Relevant authorities are notified when required. All right, in New Zealand, WorkSafe New Zealand is notified when required under HSWA 2015. And then if we look at clause 10.3, it requires improvement initiatives, and we need to have improvement records here and retain them for 3 years. And here, the evidence we must keep for auditors is that occupational health and safety performance are improving, such as reduced incidents and improved hazard identifications and enhanced controls, and workers' engagement and supporting local safety goals. For instance, this supports New Zealand's safety goals. So this is the class checklist for ISO 45001. All the records and documents you need to pass this standard. All the records, all the mandatory requirements. Now, let's look at the key verification area for auditors. Now let's look at the key verification areas for auditors. Verifications focus on observable behaviors, functioning controls, and genuine safety cultures, and not just documented procedures gathering dust on shelves. The first key verification, is traffic management plan verifications in cold chain operations, segregation of vehicles and pedestrians, clearly marked routes, and enforces speed controls. So we need to implement traffic management plan because it will be verified during the audit. And also the second one is forklift operators competency. This also is verified. The current competency records and approved refresher training alongside comprehensive near-miss investigations to prevent recurrences. All right. And then the PPE usage also verification, compliance with relevant national and international standards for hot or cold weather, procedure, and cold gear, and high visibility clothing, and safety footwear, and verification through regular checks. All right. And we must all comply with national standards. The fourth type of verification is incident reporting culture, near miss reported without fear, and through thorough investigation conducted in accordance with national safety legislations and learning shared across the organizations. All these are to be verified. The failure pattern is that procedures exist but not followed during peak periods or night shifts. This leads to potential non-compliance with local safety regulations. All right. Now let's move to the checklist class by class for ISO 14001-2015 for cold storage and logistics operations. And this checklist provides a class-by-class overview of ISO 14001-2015 requirements, focusing on their compliance within cold storage and logistics operation. It details mandatory requirements necessary, documentations also, and key audit evidence points you need. And also it reflects global regulatory and business context, but we will give with a specific example also from New Zealand as we did. And this is recorded in February 2026. So you might look for updates if you are watching in the future. In ISO 14001, class 4.1 requires you to determine internal and external issues and review annually also, similar to other standards. The audit evidence here, you must present that environmental issues are identified, such as climate change impacts on cold chain resilience and resources scarcity, and community expectations regarding energy use and waste, and regulatory trends. All these must be identified in your internal and external issues. For example, in New Zealand, this is in compliance with RMA 91 amendments, and New Zealand ETS evaluation. In class 4.2, it requires you to determine interested parties and environmental requirements to be reviewed annually also and retain the record for 3 years. Auditor will look here for evidence of community, regulatory, customers, industry bodies, and NGOs being identified with environmental expectations. Specifically, an example in New Zealand here, the regulators like EPA and regional council like Auckland Council or Environmental Canterbury, and Safe Work New Zealand, those are the regulators. And for customers, you have Food Staff and Woolworth New Zealand, and industry bodies, you have Cold Chain Council of New Zealand. So all the interested parties must be identified, all right, with their requirements, environmental requirements. Then in class 4.3, you are required to determine the scope of EMS. So you must review your scope as a documented information, and the scope must be reviewed and retained for the life of the certifications. In your scope, it must reflect that all relevant sites, this is the evidence required, all relevant sites and activities such as refrigerations and transport and products and services are covered in your scope by the environmental management system. For example, in New Zealand, all sites in New Zealand in North and South Island must be covered. And then in class 4.4, it requires you to establish, implement, and maintain and continually improve environmental management system as a documented information, and you must have process records and retain them for 3 years as documented information as well. The evidence the auditor will look for here include environmental processes being identified and controlled within the organization. Those are the requirements of class 4. And if we move to class 5 of ISO 14001-2015, class 5.1 requires leadership and commitment as a documented information as well. And here, the leadership evidence must be kept for 3 years. The evidence in relation to leadership commitment that the auditor will look for, including evidence that management takes accountability for environmental performance and environmental policy must be established, and adequate resources must be provided. For example, in New Zealand, accountability by the New Zealand Management for Environmental Performance must be considered. In class 5.2, it requires you to establish environmental policy. And here, the policy must be established and reviewed and retained for the duration of the certification. The auditor will look for evidence of commitment to protect the environment, must be stated in the policy, and meet legal requirements and continually improve. All these must be mentioned in your policy. Now, in class 5.3, and by the way, if you need again example of policy, just visit part 1 of this course and you will find a draft there where you can replicate. In class 5.3, it requires you to assign and communicate environmental roles, responsibilities, and authorities. And you must have assignment records also. And all these documented informations must be kept for the duration of the of the employment of anyone who is assigned plus 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence here, include environmental responsibility being assigned and communicated throughout the organization. For example, in New Zealand, the responsibilities are communicated throughout the New Zealand organization. That is class 5. Now, if we move to class 6, it requires you to determine risk and opportunities for environmental management system and review it annually and retain the records for 3 years. And the evidence the auditor is looking for is risks to EMS must be identified. Opportunities for environmental improvement also must be identified. For example, in New Zealand, the risks like non-compliance with HSNO Act of 1996 for refrigerants, and opportunities like energy efficiency grants for EECA. In Clause 6.1.2, it requires you to identify environmental aspects and determine significant aspects and consider life cycle perspective. All right. This also we have demonstrate how to conduct aspect assessment, and these requirements, the mandatory aspects identification records must be maintained for 3 years. These mandatory requirements. And your documents will be viewed by the auditor to look for evidence that all activities, products, and services are assessed for environmental aspects such as electricity for refrigeration and refrigerants and water use and waste generations and transport emission, and aspects are evaluated for significance such as the scale, frequency, severity, legal, stakeholders concern, and significant aspects are identified, and life cycle perspective also is considered. So all these must be in your aspect identification records, which is a mandatory requirement. For clause 6.3, it requires you to determine legal and other environmental requirements. And here you need compliance review, which is a mandatory requirement, and you need to retain it for 3 years. The auditor will look for evidence that all applicable environmental laws are identified, the permits are identified, the compliance status is tracked. Example here, New Zealand. Applicable laws include RMA 1991, Waste Minimization Act of 2008, and Hazardous Substances and New Organizations Act of 1996, and relevant regulation council plans and resources consent. In clause 6.1.4, it requires plan actions to address significant aspects and legal requirements and risk and opportunities. The actions records here must be retained for 3 years. The auditors will look for evidence that actions are planned for significant aspects and refrigerant and leak detections programs and action are integrated into processes. In clause 6.2, it requires you to establish environmental objectives and plans to achieve them. And here you need to retain the objective monitoring also. So you need objectives and objectives monitoring and retain them for 3 years, and these mandatory requirements. The auditors will look for evidence that your objectives are smart and measurable. For example, 10% reduction in electricity consumption by 2028 is a smart objective there, and consistent with environmental policy, addresses significant aspects, and progress is monitored. That is clause 6. In clause 7, clause 7.1 requires you to determine and provide resources for EMS or Environmental Management System. Here you need resources records and retain them for 3 years. The auditors will look for evidence to confirm that adequate resources are being provided for EMS. And for clause 7.2, it requires you to determine the competence for environmental roles and ensure competence. And here you need to keep the training records for the duration of the employment plus 7 years. The auditors will look for evidence that environmental competence requirements are defined and training is provided and competence are verified. For example, in New Zealand, competence requirements are defined for New Zealand roles, HSNO certified handler for refrigerants. And in clause 7.3, it requires you to ensure persons are aware of environmental policy and significant aspects and their contribution as well. And here you need to maintain the records with this documented information for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence that workers are aware of environmental policy and significant aspects and their environmental responsibilities. And in class 7.4, it requires you to determine environmental communication with internal and external parties. And here you need to maintain the communication records and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will confirm the evidence that environmental communication are systematic, external communications is managed. And for class 7.5, it requires controls documented information per ISO requirements. So also you need to control records here and retain it for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence that environmental documents are controlled and records are retained per the requirements. That's clause 7. If we come to clause 8, 8.1 requires you to plan, implement, control processes to meet environmental requirements and address significant aspects. And here you are required to keep process controls, process records, and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence that operational controls are established for significant aspects. And in class 8.2, it requires you to establish process for emergency preparedness and response to potential environmental emergencies. Here, you need to keep mandatory record, including emergency drill records and incident response records, mandatory to retain them for 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence of environmental emergencies being identified, for example, refrigerant spills, fuel leaks, and contamination from food spoilage. And response procedures are documented and drills are conducted and plans are reviewed and updated. That's clause 8. And in clause 9, clause 9.1.1, it requires you to determine what to monitor or measure, and methods of what to monitor or measure, and when, and also to analyze and evaluate your measurements. And here you are required to keep this as a documented information along with monitoring records and retain them for 3 years. Auditors will confirm that environmental performance are monitored, including energy consumption per cubic meter of cold storage and refrigerants top-up rates and waste diversion rates and transport fleet emissions in compliance with, and also compliance are monitored and effectiveness of controls are also monitored. And then in class 9.1.2, it requires, the requirements here is to evaluate compliance with legal and other environmental requirements. And here is mandatory to keep the records of compliance evaluation for the period of 3 years. Auditors will look for evidence to confirm that compliance is evaluated systematically with legislations, and non-compliance are identified as well and addressed. And in clause 9.2, it requires you to conduct internal audit at planned intervals. And these are mandatory requirements to keep audit records, internal audits for environmental. And here, the auditor will need the evidence to confirm that environmental audits cover all the requirements annually. And auditors are competent in environmental management, and non-conformities are identified and corrected. And then in clause 9.3, it requires top management review of environmental management system at planned interval. And here, mandatory requirements is to keep records of management review for the period of 3 years. The auditors will look for evidence that reviews are conducted minimum annually, and all requires inputs are considered, and decisions and actions are documented. And in clause 10.2, it requires that when nonconformities occurs, you need to determine causes, take corrective actions, evaluate effectiveness, and make changes to environmental management system. And here, corrective actions records are mandatory requirements to be kept with this documented system or documented information for 3 years. And the auditor will confirm that environmental nonconformities are addressed, and root causes are identified, and effectiveness is verified, and EMS is updated. And in clause 10.3, it requires you should continually improve environmental performance. And here you are required to maintain this documented information along with improvement records for the period of 3 years. So auditors will look for evidence to confirm that environmental performance are improving, such as achieving set reduction targets and proactive improvement culture throughout the operations. Now let's look at ISO 14001 impact control. The auditor expectation here is for environmental management must influence real decision within an organization and not just produce reports that sit unread. So if we look at key control elements here, you should have significant impact identification, or the significant impacts must be identified, such as energy use, refrigerant emissions, and waste generation, and assessed for significance in line with applicable regulations, frameworks, and environmental principles. For example, in New Zealand context, they must be assessed for significance in line with Resources Management Act of 1991, RMA principles. And also the legal obligations must be known, compliance with requirements understood and tracked systematically, including national and local environmental legislations. For example, in New Zealand, this includes the Resources Management Act of 1991, Hazardous Substance and New Organism Act of 1996, and specific regional council plans and resources consent relevant to coal storage and legislations. The other key control element is monitoring data reviewed. You must review your monitoring data for energy consumption, refrigerant levels, and waste volumes must be analyzed for trends supporting performance improvements. And another elements of controls is objectives to be set. Your objectives must be measurable environmental improvement targets with assigned responsibility contributing to broader environmental goals. The other element of control is emergency preparedness, including spill response equipments, procedures, and trained personnel available, with consideration for guidance from relevant health and safety authorities on hazardous substances. For example, this includes guidance from WorkSafe New Zealand. Now let's look at HSE Audit Stage 2 foundation. Stage 1 foundation, sorry. Let's look at its HSE Stage 1 Audit Foundations. HSE Stage 1 Health, Safety, and Environmental audits assess whether an organization has identified its hazards and environmental aspects and understand its legal obligations under relevant legislations, and has planned appropriate controls. This is particularly crucial for cold storage and logistics operations globally to ensure compliance with best practices. For instance, in New Zealand context, new compliance requirements are set. For example, now they will assess hazards and aspect registers in the stage 1 audit of HSE. They will they will conduct review of documented hazards specific to cold storage and logistics. For example, they will assess your ammonia leaks documents, working at heights, confined space, all these documents, and environmental aspects like refrigerant emissions and emergency consumptions and waste generations, and also their significance assessments as per ISO 14001 principles. So they will review the documents and they will assess their significant assessment has been carried out as per the principles of ISO 14001. For example, in New Zealand, in regard to hazard and aspect registers, local impacts and risks for companies like Foodstuff and Woolworths should be considered. Secondly, in stage 1, they will also assess legal compliance and regulatory engagement. They will conduct verification that legal obligations under relevant national legislations are identified, documented, and assigned for monitoring. In this case, for example, in New Zealand context, this includes the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015, Food Safety Act of 2014, Resources Management Act of 1991, and Health and Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act of 1996. All right, so they will verify that legal legislations, all these are identified and documented and assigned for monitoring. And also engagement with regulatory bodies such as WorkSafe New Zealand and MPI or Ministry of Primary Industry for food safety programs, and EPA or Environmental Protection Authority is also typically required. So you will be assessed. They will verify that your legal registration in your own countries are identified and documented and assigned for monitoring. Similar to examples I give you from New Zealand, you can replicate that in your own country. Thirdly, they will also assess your emergency preparedness. They will assessment of emergency response plans for incidents like refrigerant leaks, significant spills, or injuries, ensuring they align with the approved code of practice and legal emergency services. Now, if we look at HSE Stage 2 audit, Stage 2 of the HSE audit for cold storage and logistics operations moves to the warehouse floor. Okay, so they will be doing it in warehouse floor, not in the office anymore, reviewing documents. So they will move to the floor, observing actual behavior and verifying controls effectiveness against the relevant national guidelines and testing emergency response readiness in accordance with national health and safety legislations and applicable food safety requirements. So this in stage 2 here, they will be doing real work down there in on the ground floor, on the shop floor. And that's why we need our team to be adequately trained and not only document completion, because they will be tested in real time. Now, for example, in New Zealand, This involves adherence to WorkSafe New Zealand guidelines, the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015, and relevant Ministry for Primary Industry (MPI) requirements. And this is where theoretical compliance meets operational reality, with New Zealand serving as a key example for the robust regulations environment. So this also requires awareness of the local legislations and having access to communication and also documents from local regulatory. Now, this is what will happen. First, the on-floor behavior and safety practice. They will observe the practices and the management protocol there, and they will see how people use the PPE and how they adhere to workplace practices during their normal operations. And also, they will ensure the compliance with national approved code of practice. All right. And also the contractor control and oversight. They will also verify, the auditor will verify there the induction processes, the permit to work system. They will review your permit to work also and see how it's going on. Okay. And robust contractor supervision. They will also observe how supervision is going, and they will interact with the contractors if possible, and they will ensure that an external personnel are aligned with national health and safety obligations and safety facility requirements. And then also they will check the emergency response readiness. They will test the alarm system, the auditors there, and the evacuation procedure and first aid readiness, with particular attention to potential hazards in cold storage environment. For example, the refrigerant leaks, also they will check that inspection, and adhering to national hazardous substances regulations. So this is how they will carry out stage 2. Now let's look at the excellent signals of HSE that you can also adapt. Excellence in HSE globally is characterized by proactive risk management, open communication, and continuous monitoring, and not reactive compliance. The first signal of excellence in HSE is near miss reporting. The near misses are reported without fear of blame and thoroughly investigated under internationally recognized best practices for incident management, and proactively used by organizations to prevent future incidents. So when near misses are reported freely and the proactive actions are taken and the best practices are implemented to improve based on near misses without dismissing them and saying it doesn't happen yet, so we don't need to worry about it. When you shift your mentality and you take the lead, that is one of the indicators that signal the excellence of your operations in HSE. And also the environmental monitoring. When the energy consumptions and refrigerants usage are tracked monthly, when you have your trend analysis for the energy consumption, and you drive the efficiency in line with, with the guidelines in your own country. So this is also an indicator of HSE excellence. And finally, the early intervention, when you take proactive actions to intervene on unsafe behaviors and take actions before they become bigger problems. Those are also indicators. All right. So everything we have taught you so far about HSE definitely is the easier part, the HSE. The only part you need, the risk register and the aspects assessment and identification with their impact assessment. Those are the major parts you need to pay attention to and try to do them thoroughly. And also the forklift safety, the PPE, the workers' participation and consultations. All right. So you have few elements that we highlight. If you pay attention to it and you provide all the checklist documentations, you will be certified in HSE, which means in ISO 45001 and also ISO 14001. Thank you, and see you in part 3. In part 3, we are going to cover the ISO 22000 for food safety. All right, take care.